Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Gary Kelsey, and with me this morning is Dr. James Williams. Dr. Williams is a public policy and administration graduate at Walden University. Dr. Williams graduated in May of 2019, and this morning he is going to be presenting his research, Rising Above the Fray, Career Ascension of African American Men in the Army Warrant Officer Corps, and then answer a few questions related to his research and his life following graduation. Dr. Williams?
Yes, Dr. Kelsey, good morning. Thank you to all the scholars at Walden and around the world. I bid you good morning. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge, as we are closing out the month of May, which is Military Appreciation Month, all of the service members, veterans, whether you've served in the Army, Air Force, Marine Corps, Navy, and Coast Guard, thank you for your service. Again, I'm Dr. James Williams. I am a Walden graduate conferred in May of 2019. Nothing would be what it is without acknowledging some of my accomplishments. As I said, I started out in the Army, September of 2018, as depicted on the left pic there at the top. And I recently retired of November of 2019, 31-year career. This slide is just a pictorial of most of my accomplishments. I served overseas in Hawaii. I was also an adjunct in the second pic there on the second row. There is a pic of CW5 Dave Williams, no relation, who was the senior Army Warrant Officer for the Department of the Army Staff. And on the far right, of course, there's a picture of myself and a leader whom I respect, Dr. Colin Powell. I'm also an award-winning author. My first book was Chasing the Eagle: From Dreaming to Achieving Success and Freedom. It's a narrative nonfiction that portrays my humble beginnings growing up in Cleveland, Ohio to where I am today. And then, of course, my second co-authored book project is Mission Unstoppable: Extraordinary Stories of Failure's Blessings. Very proud of those works. And of course, at the bottom row, the center of gravity of my life is my family. That's my wife and son volunteering in one of the posts in Hawaii where I was stationed, and then all the way across. We like to take the time for leisure as well, and that's a picture of us in Anguilla, right off of the coast of St. Martin. I work for Northrop Grumman, and there we are. So my presentation speaks to the African American men who served in the Army Warrant Officer Corps. African Americans have served and contributed to the United States Armed Forces as far back as we can remember. This slide depicts the rank structure. At the top, you have a list of rank E1 to E9. And there's the officer rank, O1 to O10. And then at the very bottom is the Warrant Officer Corps, very understated, sort of unsung heroes, as we like to call it, of Warrant Officer 1 through Warrant Officer 5. I retired as a CW5, Warrant Officer 5, which were called the quiet professionals, and in most instances were called the unicorn when you reach the rank of CW5. Next slide. So the background is there was once a segregated army where whites and black soldiers could not integrate during the war. Blacks were more subservient, doing servitude types of work. And it wasn't until the executive order signed that allowed the integration of white and soldiers to coexist in an armed service. Next slide. So what is a warrant officer anyway? Well, a warrant officer is an officer that's in the U.S. Armed Forces ranking right below the commissioned officers, but just above non-commissioned officers. The Warrant Officer Corps was established in 1918, and according to the Army statistic data, the warrant officer population makes up 3% of the total Army, 64% of which are white warrant officers and 17% are Black. Next slide. This is the warrant officer rank structure. The time and grade for a technician warrant officer is from Warrant Officer 1 to Warrant Officer 2 is 2 years. From Warrant Officer 2 through 5, it's an average of 4 to 5 years time and grade. If you're an aviator, depicted in the blue, it's 2 years between WO1 and CW2, and 5 to 6 years respectively time and grade to Warrant Officer 5. I should point out that in the reserve component, technician warrant officers are 2 years from W1 to W2 and 5 to 6 years from CW2 through 5. Next slide. So why this study? I became curious about this study after achieving the rank of CW5 myself, and I was approached by several service members of all branches of service, and they asked the question, so Chief Williams, how is it that you were able to attain the rank of CW5? That's a rare feat, especially as an African American. Now, of course, up to this point, I'd never really looked at my race and ethnicity as reasons for ascending to these ranks. And so I became curious, and I decided to do research to find out, well, what were other experiences of the African American population who served? And what I found is that there was no data of Blacks that served prior to 1941. Likewise, there were barriers to promotions for those that may have ascended to those ranks. And more importantly, fewer African American men ascended to the highest ranks, which was my experience when I achieved that rank. I didn't see many people that looked like me, particularly African American men. So what I found was there were no captured experiences for African American men who achieved the rank. And so my quest was to become curious as to those who did achieve the rank of CW5, what were their success strategies and motivational factors that allowed them to achieve such rank, and thus began my study. Next slide. The purpose of this phenomenological research study was to capture the actual lived experiences of African American men who achieved this rank of CW5. I chose the retired population. The social impact of this issue of data will inform policymakers at the service level as well as DOD on equity and meritocracy of the career progression in the Corps. This research is hoping to provide a blueprint for any of those that aspire to become a soldier in all branches, and particularly navigating their career path, in this instance, in the Warrant Officer Corps. Next slide. There were 3 research questions. The main research question, how do retired African American male officers describe their experience of attaining the rank of Senior Field Grade Warrant Officer, or CW5, in the United States Warrant Officer Corps? The sub-question 1 asks, what are the experiences which shape the achievements of African American men serving in senior leadership positions in the Army Warrant Officer Corps? And following that is sub-question 2, what strategies do African American men believe they used to reach the rank of Senior Field Grade Warrant Officer? Next slide. This was a qualitative study in order to add to the literature of the Army Warrant Officer population. This was a very understudied effort. I was not able to find any research specific to the Warrant Officer Corps, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, otherwise. There were certainly research studies on the enlisted population, the officer population to include 1-star and 4-star generals. Lots of research on those entities, but not in the Warrant Officer Corps. So the selected research was designed as a phenomenological study, which is to capture the researchers capturing the lived experiences of the participant. I used a modified Van Camp method by Moustakis that allows the researcher to investigate the actual lived experiences of the participant. Next slide. This was a snowball sample size population of about 300. As I earlier mentioned, the Warrant Officer Corps makes up about 3% of the total Army. And so when fielding participants, there was a really small pool that I had to choose from. Several reasons for that. One, I didn't have a large quantity of data to be able to pull from the population. So I used a sample size from an organization called the United States Army Warrant Officer Association. Shout out to CW4, Jack Dutille, who was the executive director there. He allowed me to use this snowball sample size. And from that sample size, I fielded 32 respondents. And from that respondent list, narrowed it down to 15 finalists. And so 10 participants were selected as the final sample size of the study. Now, inclusion exclusion criteria for the participants is that you had to be African American, retired at the rank of CW5 in the Army Warrant Officer Corps. Now, of course, my sample size, I received a lot of feedback from those that were not African American, and they were very supportive of my study, recognizing that they did not fit the criteria. It was a very humbling experience. Next slide. So from my demographic data characteristics, the participants were used as pseudonames to protect the innocent. And this slide depicts the varied occupations, branches of service, years of service, and the dates of the interviews. For example, Armstrong has an education level of a master's degree. His years of service between W1 and W5 were 18 years. His military service in total, 31 years. His enlisted rank coming into the Warrant Officer Corps was E5, and he retired CW5, and he was a human resource technician. So from this particular characteristic data, you can see the various educational levels. You notice each participant had at least an associate's degree. There were some that had master's degrees, and we have 2 that had PhDs. One thing I wanted to note is from W2 to W5, that simply meant that the participant came in at the rank of W2 and did not have to come in as a W1. And that is noted with Clayton and Howard respectively. But I also want to point your attention to the years of service. Just as a breakdown, if you've served 20 years active duty, your retired pay would be at 50%, 75% if you serve 30 years, and if you serve 40 years or more, you will retire at 100% base pay. You can see here that Daryl, Isaac, and Jasper respectively served a total of more than 40 years and retired at full 100% pay. I point this out because there are very few organizations in which you work for 40 years and end up with 100% of your pay. Well, that was the case with these participants. Also noted are the various career fields: human resources, air traffic controller, nuclear warfare systems, CID special agent. So these participants were not monolithic in their career field choices, yet they were able to still ascend to the rank of CW5. Next slide. From my research and the data analysis and the coding respectively, emerged 9 themes: competence in primary functional area, aspiration, overcoming barriers to promotion, proven leadership style, mentorship, educational opportunities, establish a career roadmap, excel through the Army promotion system, and faith. These were the themes that were emerged from my questions and in interviews to the participants. These were the top 9 themes that emerged. Next slide. So getting back to research question results, number 1, how do retired African-American male officers describe their experience of attaining the rank of senior field grade officer in the Army Warrant Officer Corps? 2 themes emerged from this question. Aspiration was among the many. Many of the participants indicated that they aspired to become a warrant officer after watching and viewing the demeanor, the soldierization of fellow warrant officers that made them decide that they wanted to become an officer. And also educational opportunities. Many of these participants hailed from the southeastern part of the United States. Separated by education, they weren't able to get the educational opportunities because of their ethnicity. And so the Army provided that for them, and that was the genesis behind them joining the military and ultimately the Warrant Officer Corps. Next slide. What are the strategies do African American men believe that they used to reach the rank of CW5? Quite a few themes here. Overwhelmingly, the competence in your primary functional area reigned supreme. Many of the participants indicated it's very important to learn your job, to learn it well, and in some instances, learn it better than your peers, especially come promotion time. Their proven leadership style, whether it was transformational, transactional, situational, their leadership style helped them to ascend to the rank of CW5. Being able to communicate effectively, not only to your peers, to your subordinates, but also to senior leadership. Very important. Excelling through the Army promotional system. Having the military educational background compared to your peers would make it more likely than not that you would ascend to the ranks, and even at the CW5 rank where the slim pickings are quite slim. Excelling through the Army promotional system, making sure that you meet all the criteria, help these participants to become successful. And then lastly, is not to settle on your laurels. Many of the participants indicated that they established a career roadmap. So as an example, if a participant made it to CW3, they would think beyond their job description and already think 1 to 2 ranks above in preparing for that next promotion. Next slide. So how do the findings relate to the literature? Well, with meritocracy, is it fact or fallacy? Many believe that if you string up by your bootstraps, you can be successful. If you work very hard, you will be merited what you deserve. And while that is true in some entities, there are persons who work very, very hard for years and may not receive the financial outcome as expected and may not necessarily move up. Achievement scores tests in black and white. The ASVAB test, which is a test designed to determine what particular skill set most fits you, this is where African Americans fall way back. In my research, we found that the test scores, the lower the test scores, the less likely you would receive a skill that would be often transferable should you decide to either retire or separate from the Army. As an example, to become a warrant officer, you need a general technical score of 110. And the general technical score is an average of all of the particular scores that are shown in the ASVAB. And if the average is at least 110 or more, you are likely to qualify, you actually will qualify for officer to include warrant officer. In my research, many of the African American population just did not fare well on these tests and therefore did not receive the outcomes of the types of jobs that were offered that would allow them to excel. Then there's African American men in mentoring. Many of the participants expressed that mentorship was by far a key component in them progressing into the warrant officer ranks. Let me also mention that the mentorship did not necessarily include African Americans in particular. There were many researchers, or I should say participants, who indicated that white officers, white enlisted, made recommendations for these participants to join the Warrant Officer Corps because they saw them and their capabilities and that they had value. So African American men in mentoring was important. Race and leadership. Well, from history, we know that African Americans were never poised to be leaders because we were always subservient during slavery. So there was never a blueprint mapped out for African Americans. So race and leadership became an issue in my research. One example would be President Barack Obama becoming president of the United States, the first African American male to do so. And in my research, it was suggested that Barack Obama, as compared to the late Senator John McCain, that Barack Obama looked believable, trustworthy. He was also physically fit, another factor in leadership among African American men. Charismatic, and more importantly, his youth. Black male leaders and white male subordinates. How do white male leaders view their leaders who are African American? My literature suggested that, again, physical fitness, your height, charismatic leadership, how are you able to command the English language, as well as knowing your job, garnered more respect from white male subordinates than not. Next slide. So the framework that I used was a three-prong approach. I used the upper echelon theory, the McClellan theory of motivation, and the resiliency theory. I want to put particular emphasis on the motivational theory, which is sort of a three-legged stool, I should say. There is the need for affiliation, the need for power, and the third is the need for assimilation. The resiliency theory speaks to how do you thrive through adversity? A loss of a loved one, a loss of a job, a health concern. How do you bounce back from resilience from an incident that may have occurred at one point in time in your life? These were the three frameworks that was used in my research. Next slide. What are the social change implications? Future study expansion could add to the literature not yet explored that could provide a blueprint for future soldiers aspiring to join the Warrant Officer Corps. This research's aim is to inform senior leaders, recruiters, of course, policymakers, on how to better recruit the minority population that would yield a diverse military force. This model can also be used not only in the public sector, but the private sector as well, to create a diverse workforce and African American men serving in senior executive positions, particularly in corporate America. So this research is really setting out social change on what a diverse workforce looks like when the population at the top mirrors the population at the bottom. Next slide. So I've got some trivia questions here. The first of which is, who was the first and only African American four-star to be appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Second is, who was the first appointed African-American senior warrant officer for the Department of the Army? And then finally, who was the first African-American Army warrant officer? Next slide. First pick, surprise, surprise, General Colin Powell was the first African-American to serve at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Picture number 2 may be less familiar to some and quite familiar to others. That is CW5 retired David Williams, no relation. He was appointed as the senior staff warrant officer for the Department of the Army. And sadly, the third picture, as you can see, is an empty frame of a hollow silhouette. And what that depicts is that there is no known research as to who the first African-American warrant officer was, which is what really speaks to why I did this study. There is a huge gap. As I mentioned earlier, no research for emphasis on warrant officers serving prior to 1941. And here we are in 2020, and that information is still a mystery. So for someone out there who wishes to expand the study, you have my support and all of my research. And I want to give a shout out to the retired CW4 Pharrell Childs, who was a pinnacle pioneer in researching African Americans. And it is from his inspiration that spawned me to take on this Herculean task. So Mr. Childs, if you're out there, thank you for what you do. I salute you. Next slide. Here's a quote from Chinua Achebe, which simply states, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." We have to tell our own stories, whether it's through books, documentaries, and in this case, research. So this research is cemented as history for those unspoken voices, those quiet professionals that will now have a place in scholarly history. Next slide. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the team that helped this scholarship research to be possible. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Janet Hunter, who was my chair, Dr. Glenn Starts, my committee member, and especially retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Michael Brewer, who was my URR member, and of course, all the faculty, staff, fellow cohorts, to include you, Dr. Kelsey, thank you. Next slide. This is my contact information. As a result of this study, I've now become a scholar, author, speaker, and veteran. It's my email address, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And finally, this concludes my presentation. I really appreciate all those who are listening. Hopefully you've garnered some valuable information. Thank you so much. I invite your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Great presentation. And I know one that will not only motivate others, but hopefully will spur them on to future research as well. As you know, you have presented now several times in front of several of our student audiences. And there were a lot of great questions that came up. And I want to throw a couple of them out to you for our recording today. And the first is, was there anything about this research that surprised you?
Very good question, Dr. Kelsey. Yes, there was. I went into this research open-minded. I did not want to make any preconceived notions. I wanted to be particularly careful as to not show bias, as I am an African-American male who reached the rank of CW5. A couple of things surprised me. One, the varied career fields that these participants had. I was quite frankly, very surprising. Not that African Americans should be viewed ever as monolithic, but the various fields that these participants chose was very surprising. Nuclear missile technician, criminal investigation, information technology, human resources. So I was very clear to make sure that the study had an array of skill sets that no matter what fields these participants were in, they excelled. The other thing that was surprising is, contrary to popular belief, while there were certainly discriminatory practices that took place among these participants, and they weren't shy in explaining those, by and large, they all indicated that they had a successful career and would not change a thing. So what this told me was that this was really a strength-based research as opposed to a deficit-based research. We know that racism, discrimination, implicit and explicit bias does exist, but we also know that regardless of those barriers and obstacles, you can still thrive through those core themes that I mentioned in the study. So that was a very good revelation for me, to know that there's not a one-size-fits-all to achieve what you want to achieve. Great question.
Thank you. I'm curious about your notation, which is very interesting. And history has a lot of holes in it, obviously, especially for those who have at times been marginalized or oppressed or left out. You had said that there was no way of knowing who was it the first African-American warrant officer? Why would that be? Why would they not have records? Or do you know, can you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And I got to tell you, before I was able to put this to pen, I dug in all research elements: Library of Congress, historical societies. The Warrant Officer Corps also has what's called the Warrant Officer Heritage Society. And I also mentioned my good friend and colleague, Fray Childs, who's a retired CW4 Army Warrant Officer himself, really did the groundbreaking research to discover this feat in his books that he's written. I wanted to take it further through a scholarly approach, but what I found was that not only was there not documentation of the first African-American warrant officer, but there was no research at all on warrant officers. And so to answer your question, I think the reason is because you have to consider the time that we were in at that point in time. African-Americans were not considered equal. Even those that joined the military did so in servitude to white officers. So for example, if you had a white officer and a black officer, the black officer could not lead a team or troops who were white. This is why you had these separate entities like the Tuskegee Institute, Black Buffalo Soldiers, etc. So why would there be a need to document any history related to African Americans? Now that would be a little different in slave times, where you documented your labor, age, sex, to be able to determine what type of labor that would best suit them. But that was not the case for wartime, because remember, the war was not designed for African Americans to serve in it. So there were no historical documents that showed any warrant officer. Now keep in mind that the Warrant Officer Corps was established in 1918. So from 1918 to 1941, we just don't know. There is no documentation, because it was always a separate entity for African Americans who served. And so that was really kind of disturbing, but the hard truth in my research is that there was not an incentive to highlight any contributions African Americans made, and the Warrant Officer Corps was no different.
Right. Thank you very much. That helps add a bit more light to this topic. And sadly, it's very true, but in terms of the gifts and the time and the effort, the laying down your lives that people have given for service, that there's not equality of acknowledgement and affirmation and honoring individuals. Since you finished your research, have you had an opportunity to present this research to others at this point? And what would you like to do with it moving forward?
Wow, what a great question. First of all, I have to give acknowledgement to the Walden University community, to include yourself. As you know, I've presented at several residencies, from Tampa, Florida, to the National Harbor in Maryland, certainly several virtual opportunities. Even amidst the COVID virus, the research and the presentations continued. I was really excited to present this research at the annual Black Doctoral Network, which is a organization for scholars that are JDs, MDs, PhDs, and doctorates. And that was in Newark, New Jersey last year. I was able to present there. It's been an amazing experience. I've been asked to create an article, a book, and dare I say, some have even asked, I think it was one of the Walden faculty, that I should consider a documentary. And since that revelation, I have thought about it. I'm right now in the process of seeing how I can work that project and assemble a team. I think this will be a fantastic historical issue that many taxpayers in the United States aren't even familiar with. So this is an added educational experience, much like we see in the Ken Burns documentaries. I've seen all of them. He does great work. Certainly Skip Gates, who presents African-American history. But interestingly enough, Dr. K, none of them speaks to warrant officers. There's enlisted soldiers, there's officers, but no warrant officers. So this would certainly be a Herculean task, and one that would be for the history of the ages. And so, yeah. But as of last week, I did submit my research to a colleague at the Department of the Army to see if this can be escalated to the Department of the Army policy group that can take a look at this and maybe revisit the models of how to better recruit African Americans. Because the truth is, African American, as mentioned, is only 17% of the total population of warrant officers, male and female. And that needs to change. And let me just caveat by saying, of all the branches of service, who has done a fine job of leading the charge for diversity, the Army leads, number one. I think the Navy follows that, followed by the Marine and the Coast Guard. So I don't want there to be a misconstrued of the statements that the Army does a terrible job, because we're leading the charge in terms of all of the branches of service. However, we can do better. We can do better.
Thank you. Those are all very exciting opportunities, and so good to know that there are so many things that come out of research like this, so many opportunities that are yet for you to take advantage of and to share what your work is, and to hopefully help others add their own work as well. So that's very, very exciting. The last question I have before I ask if there's any last thing you would like to say or share with those watching this video today would be, can you talk a little bit about how your life has changed, perhaps personally as well as professionally, due to gaining your doctorate degree? And is it different than what you thought it might be when you started on this journey? What has been the imprint, if you will, or the outcome of having a doctorate on your life?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I can only think back to my whole reason for joining the Army. I'll tell you a very quick capsule version of my story. So in 1985, I received a scholarship to attend Howard University. My major at the time, believe it or not, was journalism. I had a scholarship for a journalism degree. Sadly, my funds depleted in my junior year, and so I had to withdraw from the university. I washed dishes, I swept floors, here living in the nation's capital. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio originally. This is a very expensive town. But I knew that I wasn't going to go back to Cleveland because there just weren't opportunities for me there. So I joined the Army Reserves. September 19th, 1988. Only set out to participate in the GI Bill, pay for college. And Dr. K, it turned out to be something much greater. 8-year contract turned into a 31-year career. I just retired November of 2019. My last date in uniform was October 2019, and I had the ceremony November 2019. That's following receiving the doctorate. So what does all this mean? Sometimes you choose your career, and other times your career chooses you. And after doing this research, which was not something I initially set out to do, I am even more humbled and honored and privileged to be among the men and women who serve. And in particular, I am especially grateful for the Warrant Officer Corps for what I've been provided, for the experience that I've gained, for the leadership skills that were honed in. And I felt it an obligation beyond just service to put this information out there to the world, because people need to know contributions made, and I just didn't want it to be lip service based on what I did, which is why I chose the participants I chose to tell their stories. And if I am so fortunate to do the documentary, I think this would be something that should be in every household across the globe, to know about the quiet professionals, as what we're called, and oftentimes unsung heroes. That would be an honor. So I'm just honored and privileged that this doctoral degree allows me to legitimately tell my story through scholarly research and not through anecdotal evidence. And I'm very proud of that. And the final thing I'll say is, the doctorate is very personal to me because my mom and dad, they never finished high school. And so this is for my mom, a person who was a single mom of 4 children. I'm the oldest of 4. She was 16 when I was born. And so education is very important. My grandfather, as I indicated in my dissertation, had a 3rd grade education. He signed his name with an X. Could not read or write, but he had wisdom that I have yet to find anyone who could rival. So I do this for them. This doctorate degree is personal in the sense that while I've been tremendously blessed in my career, by trade, I am a cyber systems engineering manager working for a major Fortune 500 company. The doctorate allows me to add another olive branch to my family tree, Dr. K, and that is priceless.
Thank you so much. I think your story will motivate, will encourage, will certainly help those who are coming up behind you yet, who are still on their doctoral journey, to not only finish their degree, but to see that there's light at the end of that tunnel and there's some exciting times ahead for once they finish the research to really make that positive social change that we talk about at Walden University so often. That it's not about doing research for research's sake, it's about doing research to make a real difference. Whether that difference is for an individual, for your family, for your neighborhood, your community, your state, the country, or beyond. That's all vitally important, and you certainly have shown that and are a great example of that. Was there any last things you'd like to say, Dr. Williams, before we sign off this morning?
First, again, Dr. K, I'd like to very much thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my research, now hopefully to the world. And to anyone who's out there who thinks that they can't do anything, whether it's join the military, own a business, dare I say, earn a doctorate. I don't mind telling you that I'm 55 years old. I achieved my doctorate at age 54. It's never too late. This story has to be told, which is what encouraged me to pursue it. I'm very proud of it. It's something that can't be taken away. And I would encourage all of my scholars, particularly those at Walden University, stick to it and make sure that your research is something that you're curious about rather than something that you're passionate about. And I say that because if you're too passionate about a particular subject, you may get too acquainted with the data and you may never finish. So the path that I took of becoming curious about why are there too few African Americans who serve at the rank of CW5, but more importantly, I flipped it by wondering, well, those that did make the rank of CW5, what were their experiences? And I tell you, the takeaway is priceless, because what I learned is that within a 5-mile radius of any zip code, there is greatness all around you. And if you want to achieve, you can. These 10 participants can. And if they hear me under the sound of my voice, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share your voice that is now part of scholarly history. Thank you, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. This is one story and certainly one accomplishment that will not be forgotten and will not go undocumented. So thank you again very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kelsey.